In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate several tips and tricks to neatly finish the bind-off edge at the corner where the bind-off ends. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. What I have here is a swatch that was knit in garter stitch, and I've bound off the edge, and it looks fine until we get to this corner, and the edge goes up and off to the left, and this stitch is enlarged. I'm going to offer two tips today for improving this corner, which will be particularly important if these edges are going to remain exposed when the project is complete. So first, I want to talk about why the last stitch you work in a bind-off row is enlarged like this. Here I have a swatch that's on the needles, and you can see that the first stitch of the row is enlarged here. And this is true when you're working flat. The first stitch of the row is going to be enlarged, and there's nothing that you can do about it at this point. If you try to tighten it up by pulling on the working yarn, all you're going to do is tighten up the stitches on the needle. That does nothing to what's under the needle. But notice what happens after you work the first few stitches of the row. At this point, that very first stitch of the row that was enlarged is no longer enlarged. I didn't make any effort to try to work tighter. In fact, I made an effort to work just as evenly and with just the same tension as I worked all the other stitches. That enlarged stitch is the result of working flat, because the last stitch of every row has no neighbor to its right over here. It's only connected to the stitch on its left and the stitch below it. And that's why it gets that enlarged look. But once you start working in the other direction, that stitch will twist back on itself and it will come back into shape just like all of the others. But that's why the last stitch of a bind off is enlarged. It's because it's just like every other last stitch of the row. It's enlarged, and because you're not working another row after the bind off, it doesn't come back down to size. So what we can do is plan ahead for the bind off so that when we do work the last stitch of the bind off, it won't be enlarged. So here I have the smooth side of the cast on facing me, and the yarn tail is over to the left. And so the next time this face of the fabric is toward me is when I'm going to want to bind off. So I'm about to work the last row before the bind off. So I'm going to turn the work. So the first tip is something that you will do if you have been working the first stitch of every row as a normal stitch and you have not been slipping it. If you have been slipping the first stitch of every row, continue to slip it the way you have. But if you're working in garter stitch or seed stitch and you've just been working the stitches as regular stitches, then this is the tip you're going to want to do. So I've got the yarn in back, just like I'm getting ready to work a typical row of garter stitch. And I'm going to enter just as if I was about to knit, but instead of knitting, I'm just going to let it slip off of the needle. And then I'm going to continue on. I don't want to slip it like I would for the twisted chain in this particular case, because that won't give me as nice a result. If you've already been working in a twisted chain, continue to do that so that your edges will match, but only if you've been working these stitches as regular knits at the edge do I want you to slip as if to knit. And what you'll see is that by slipping as if to knit with the yarn in back, I've created this wrap around bump along the edge instead of a twisted chain. I don't want something that looks like a twisted chain if I've already got bumps on the edge. Now I'm going to begin binding off. Now I'm at the last bind off. I work it as I would normal, and I pass the stitch over the last stitch. Then you'd cut your yarn. Mine's already cut, but this is the point where you'd cut your yarn. Now this is where the second tip enters into it. When the instructions tell you to pull the tail out or through the last stitch, they don't mean for you to put this tail through the loop that's on the needle. That's what causes this final bind off chain to kind of come up and off to the left so much. Instead, the last chain that you have here is wrapped around both legs of this particular stitch. All you need to do is pull this bigger and bigger until the tail comes out of that last chain, and it's still wrapped around this single strand now. So that shortens the chain, it prevents it from extending further out. Then the last thing that you need to do is weave in these ends. And so what I typically do is I go down through that first bump below where the bind off chain is, like this. That will help to create a corner right there. And then from there, then I would weave in my ends in on the back. Today I showed you several tricks for improving the finish of a bind-off edge worked flat. For tips and tricks on a jogless bind-off edge worked in the round, you might like this video over here. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.